Thank you to the Global Ethical Finance Initiative for partnering with us on this Southeast Asia showcase today, entitled Turning the Tide on Climate Change Through Sustainable Finance. In this session, we will focus primarily on the E of ESG. The agenda is as follows. There will be a regional overview by Chiaronian of the World Bank, based in Bangkok. And then we'll have a panel session whereby the panelists will introduce with remarks for about 5 minutes or so. And then at the end of the last panelist, we will go into a panel discussion. The speakers' bios are below or on the website for you. So without further ado, to begin the regional overview, I would like to introduce Cécile Chiaronian of the World Bank to begin her keynote address. Take it away, Cécile.
Thank you so much, Prasad, and greetings to all from Bangkok. It is my pleasure and my honor today to join you to speak at this event that's been organized by AICB. So I very much appreciate the invitation. So I will start my presentation. What I will cover today will be the following. I think it's useful to start with a little bit of context setting about the risks and the opportunities that we're talking about when it comes to sustainable finance. Then we will look into the role of the financial sector into the implementation of the Paris Agreement. We will cover a little bit of the global context, but we'll spend most of our time looking at the situation in the ASEAN economies for sustainable finance. So to get us started, this is a sort of a, starting with the risks. I mean, it is not time wasted to really underscore the risks that we're talking about in action. And so here you see sort of the risks as we lay them out in the World Bank when we look at sort of what happens if nothing's done. And there is really a business case to be made here. We see that there's a missed opportunities for economic gains if countries do not invest in low carbon innovation and production. We also anticipate a disruption in exports should there not be sort of the implementation of the net zero commitments. Stranded assets in the fossil fuel industry is another topic that I'd like to introduce here when talking about the risks. Business migration, where countries that will be actually implementing further the Paris agreements may actually find opportunities, while others will see some FDI basically and business flowing out. And finally, there are true risks in sort of the rise of structural unemployment. So we're talking here about climate change impacting our livelihood, but also really the competitiveness of our economies and the sustainability of our firms. Now, next is to look also at the business opportunities, because it's not all dark, in fact. So, if we look at the sort of opportunities, the World Bank produced a report in 2019 that is called the Lifelines Report. And that's looking at the fact that the extra cost of building resilience into infrastructure systems would really, measure around 3% of the overall investment needs. At the same time, we calculated that the overall net benefit of investing in the resilience of infrastructure in developing countries would be $4 for each dollar invested. So really, we talk here about many opportunities, and those opportunities can be found around 5 key systems that really account for over 90% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And you see them here: energy, agriculture, food and land use, cities and urban infrastructure, transport, and manufacturing. So we're really looking at the entire sort of economic system that would benefit from more investments into resilient infrastructure, resilient production. So moving on, just to put in context where the financial sector fits when it comes to supporting the Paris Agreement. So I'd like to go back to Article 2.1c of the Paris Agreement, which refers to making finance flows consistent with a pathway towards low green gas emissions and climate resilient development. So that's really sort of the role here that's been laid out formally in the Paris Agreement. And how will the financial sector enable green and resilient growth? Well, first of all, by mobilizing capital towards sustainable activities, by fostering transparency and decision-making in the economy, by providing climate and disaster risk finance instruments, and we'll talk a bit more about this later, and by managing physical and transition climate risk in financial systems. So really the financial sector has a broad role to play, for in fact reaching these goals. To elaborate a little bit on the World Bank's approach to sustainable finance, I'd like to introduce to you the Green, Resilient and Inclusive Development Framework of the World Bank Group. This is the GRID framework. And this is a way for the World Bank to look at really mainstreaming climate into everything we do and into the twin goals of, eradicating extreme poverty and reaching shared prosperity. So really, we're taking an approach in support of our client countries to really have green embedded in everything we do in pursuit of our twin goals. So what will that mean for the work that the development work moving forward? So one is really aligning climate and development. So we are really investing in climate risk diagnostics, of course, alignments with the Paris Agreement, and I've talked about this already, and measuring climate finance and impact, working with our client countries to develop their capacity in measuring risks and measuring opportunities. So that's the first. Secondly, prioritizing the system transition that is required. And that's really across the spectrum of the sort of 5 key systems that I talked about earlier. And finally, increasing finance for the transition. And what will be required, the enabler for this will be greening the financial sector, and I'll say more about this later, as well as mobilizing capital at scale towards climate-informed activities. Now, this is just to, put in one slide who are the main actors in sustainable finance. So, it will take many to tango. So there are the policy-making bodies and regulators who are absolutely critical for actually enabling these innovations that we expect to see on the climate front. That will be the policymakers, so ministries and government agencies, but also, of course, the supervisors. Then we have the financial sector, and it's not only the banks, it's the financial intermediaries more generally, the insurers, the investors. Of course, we have the private sector where a lot of the innovations will be coming from. So corporations, sectoral associations, small and large firms alike. And finally, the NGOs, charities and foundations, and all these actors that also work on advocacy to actually move to a sort of a climate-informed operational model of the world. So moving forward from intention to implementation. So here, this is just to show a little bit more or elaborate on what is it going to take for sustainable finance to play the role that is expected. So one is, there is a need for an alignment of sustainable national policies and initiatives with the global development agenda of 2030. And that means, mainstreaming climate in all of the sort of sustainability goals and targets that the world has set for itself. That, of course, includes the SDGs, but it goes beyond that. So that's number one. Number two, the development of regulatory incentives and enabling regulatory and institutional environments. So there are some actually good examples and good practices which also come from our region, which we will have a chance to talk about later. Number three, a greater integration of sustainable development goals with the national macroeconomic policies. So this is not only the job of ministries of infrastructure and urban, the ministries of finance very much need to embed these climate goals into their budget making and macroeconomic policies. Number four, the development of sustainable financial markets and instruments, where we see a role for both the government and the financial sector. Number five, the development and implementation of national sustainable and green taxonomies, another area where we see a lot of good examples in our region. And finally, the development and the diversification of the investor base for responsible investment. Now, this will conclude the part which is really about the global context setting, which I thought was very important as we then talk about the situation in Southeast Asia. And this slide gives a little bit of a sort of a map of what we're seeing as sort of, new engagements around greening financial systems. So very much, around policy and regulatory frameworks, as I mentioned, also working on standards for disclosure and reporting, a diversified product mix with markets and investors that perhaps are new, and finally impact reporting. And so this will now be my time to actually go into what the situation in ASEAN. And first of all, perhaps we can do a little bit of a stock taking on what's happening in green finance in ASEAN countries. So you see here a number of instruments, guidelines, policies, regulations that have actually been set up in the ASEAN countries. First of all, in Southeast Asia, we're really seeing, and just like in the rest of the world, an increasing demand for sustainable finance and investment. And the past 5 years in particular has seen a lot of new products and new regulatory reforms in this area. So if we look at instruments, green bonds issuance has seen steady growth. There is still a very big difference between green bond issuance volumes in emerging economies compared to the developed economies. But that said, when you look at the numbers, Southeast Asia leads the pack among the, let's say, non-China emerging economies. So there's increased awareness of business opportunities among investors and issuers for green bonds issuance. So that's the first. I'll just mention that at the regional level, the ASEAN Capital Markets Forum has issued guidelines and standards for green bonds, as well as social bonds and sustainable bonds, and sustainable and responsible investment to facilitate the coordination on policies and incentives among regulatory authorities to foster and promote such instruments. So that's one. So I mentioned the new bonds and the new bond standards that we're seeing, these guidelines from ASEAN, which actually also expand beyond the sort of capital markets into also guidelines from promoting responsible investment in food, agriculture, and forestry. If I may single out a few initiatives which I think are really worth putting on the table here to set the stage for the discussion that will ensue. In East Asia Pacific, we have 3 Singapore banks, the DBS, OCBC, and UOB, that have stopped financing altogether coal-powered plants, while other local investors are starting to invest in renewable energy projects. And we're seeing this in Malaysia, Indonesia, Myanmar, the Philippines, and Thailand. And there is actually a good pipeline for investments. Back to Singapore, where the Stock Exchange of Singapore, as well as Bursa Malaysia, have mandated that from 2018, sustainable reporting among listed companies will be required. So listed companies actually do report their ESG. And there have been ESG indices that have been introduced. So what we're seeing here is that Southeast Asia is really beginning to view sustainable finance as a business opportunity. And that's a very promising trend for the future, and one that should certainly be encouraged by government and regulators. So moving on. So I already spoke a little bit about green bonds that we have seen being issued. So this is just to give you a sense of numbers. So what are we looking at in terms of the volumes? Well, by end 2020, the ASEAN sustainability bond issuances had been valued at 7.5 billion with US dollars, with 3.8 billion using ASEAN green bond label, and 3 billion labeled as ASEAN Sustainability Bond. We've also seen, and this is really worth noting, we saw in 2018 the first sovereign green sustainability sukuk issuance in Indonesia. And then the first, it happened a year after the first corporate Greek sukuk issuance in Malaysia was issued, which was in 2017. We are working with governments all throughout the region on sort of further sovereign issuances. So there's definitely a movement here, not only on the corporate side, but also on the sovereign side. Now, we thought that it'd be useful to give you some concrete examples of what's how have assessments and analysis changed that actually embed climate risk. So here is an example of a sort of an assessment that the World Bank does, which is called the Financial Sector Assessment Program, which actually is a joint World Bank IMF assessment, where we've basically started to introduce modules that look at measuring climate risks. Now, that is really essential to be able to measure climate risks in order to actually start looking at ways to protect countries and insulate population against these risks. So in 2019, the World Bank piloted a module on climate risks and opportunities in the Philippines Financial Sector Assessment Program, which again, as I mentioned, was joint assessment with the International Monetary Fund. And the findings of this assessment allowed the regulator and the policymaker to really move forward with some reforms. So as a result of this assessment, there are green regulations for banks and investors, as well as a green taxonomy that is actually in the works. And there are all kinds of other sort of technical assistance support that the World Bank and other development partners are providing to both the government of the Philippines as well as the regulators to embed climate risk assessment into greening the financial sector. So that is one example. And by the way, the Philippines climate risk module was really among the first such modules in the world. So I would actually say that there had been only 2 other countries for which these assessments have been done. So we can be proud that in Southeast Asia, we're actually sort of at the frontier when it comes to emerging economies. So we find as the World Bank that these assessments are really critical in helping the supervisors understand better how to actually protect and for the risks, and also incentivize sort of new instruments. Another example which I would like to give, which is also really important, is the development of green taxonomies. So what do we mean by that? Well, a taxonomy is a classification of environmentally sustainable economic activities to serve as a mandatory or voluntary guideline for green financing. So it addresses some of the sort of ambiguities that one may find when actually not necessarily having a proper definition for green. And that's really a key tool for policymakers and for regulators to clarify the sort of enabling environment for sort of green instruments. So there in Southeast Asia, first of all, ASEAN is about to issue a sort of a green taxonomy. And we're working with several countries on green taxonomies. So Malaysia, but also Philippines, Indonesia, and Thailand, among others. Now, I want to just quickly talk about the market-based solutions, which of course are going to be critical. And I mentioned already the volume of these bonds. So I thought it would be just useful to kind of put on here as a beginning of this this discussion, the fact that we have seen green bonds issuances both on the sovereign side and also on the corporate side. So I will pass, being mindful of the time, I will pass quickly, but I hope that we can make these slides available after this event. There is also movement in supporting institutional investors. So here we give the example of the GPF of Thailand, where we're working actually very closely with the GPF for integrating a sustainable investment strategy via a sort of a methodology that is being developed for sort of embedding climate risk, but also ESG principles more generally into sort of investment strategies. So that's another example. And finally, my final example will actually be on sustainable activities in the insurance sectors. So that one is really perhaps a more recent shift that we are seeing in ASEAN economies, where the sort of topics of sort of greening the insurance sector is starting to be of more focus. But again, this is really looking not only to the past, but to the future. Talking about the future, looking forward, what do we expect are going to be sort of key trends in sustainable finance for our Southeast Asian economies? So we expect that, there will be more and more promoting of innovative, sustainable financing solutions and instruments by the private sector. It's really going to be the private sector that's going to find these new instruments that will help manage climate risks and opportunities, particularly as the business case gets more and more to the forefront. So governments, can play a huge role. At the end of the day, it will be the sort of businesses that will really move the needle and allow to sort of ensure that climate goals are respected. Now, the COVID-19 pandemic has both been a catastrophe for the world, as well as to some extent an opportunity. So in a sense, because it's really sort of shaken up the traditional models of development, there is an opportunity to embed climate into the recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. And in fact, the grid framework that the World Bank Group has just launched goes completely in this spirit. So perhaps this is the perfect timing to support the transition from brown to green. And also there would be really huge costs if the sort of COVID-19 recovery was focusing on brown in the interest of time. So that is something to put on the table here. Second, the mainstreaming of green financing in fiscal policy and in the financial system is a key enabler. And I talked about budget before and fiscal, but it's not only in fiscal management, it's also in public procurement, green trade, credit, equity, insurance, and institutional investors. At the sort of national and the regional levels, one will need to identify those potential environmental and social friendly projects. And that will require the coordination, quite a bit of coordination among the stakeholders whom I described earlier. So among the policymakers, but also, of course, the regulators and the enforcement agencies. Regulatory incentives for green projects is something that we're seeing more and more. One case in point, which actually I'm borrowing from the Europe model, but we're seeing that for COVID-19 recovery, there's been quite a bit of incentives for green that have been embedded. And perhaps that is something that our governments in Southeast Asia could be thinking about more as the COVID-19 recovery is sort of, hopefully, as we get to the recovery stage. Promoting impact reporting and disclosure to existing issuers, that we know is absolutely critical. And we've seen, a lot of movement here in countries like China. Hopefully that will inspire others as well in the region. And finally, awareness raising on sustainable finance among all stakeholders and the nurturing of impact investors in the region. So that's what we hope the future will look like. Now, in conclusion, there are many efforts that are underway in the international financial sector to really take these social and environmental aspects in the ASEAN region, to a global scale. This trend will continue to grow. There is no way back as more governments move to green their economies, focus on committing to climate change agendas, and more regulators require institutions to disclose sustainable finance initiatives and climate-related risks. Now, ASEAN is in a good standing. Most ASEAN countries have developed the necessary building blocks for a sustainable finance system in the past 5 years. This now is the time for taking actions, for implementing and really scaling up. And of course, my last words will be that the World Bank stands ready, and I would say the World Bank Group, to provide our continued support to our clients in this region in achieving their sustainable development goals. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cecile, for that excellent overview. In the interest of time, we are going to go straight to Lamanya Ramayar, Head of Policy and Climate Change, WWF, World Wildlife Fund Malaysia, for her opening remarks.
Thank you so much, Prasad, and thank you very much to the organizers, Jeffy, as well as AICB, for inviting WWF Malaysia to be on this panel today. Big hello to everyone from Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. So, we are discussing a really huge topic today, and there are so many aspects to it. I mean, Cecile has given just now a very wonderful, overview of many, many aspects. So in my time now, I would like to just focus on one of the important facets in Southeast Asia and Malaysia, which is our, natural endowment, nature, and how that contributes to climate. And the reason I would like to bring this up is as nature also needs very strong financial investments, so it can be secured and continue to provide critical services, ecosystem services that include addressing climate change, but not only that, which provide what we call natural capital that enables, businesses to function, for people to thrive. So, but before that, there are some things that we have to bear in mind. Firstly, global temperature rise needs to be capped at 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2100, according to science. And this has really very special significance to Southeast Asia, as we are one of the most vulnerable regions globally to projected future climate impacts. The IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, has stated that we can expect more frequent extreme weather patterns and also higher than global average sea level rise in this region. In Malaysia, what does that mean in terms of sea level rise? There's been some assessment done. It means that we would be affecting our groundwater security. There will be more coastal erosion, saltwater intrusion, and even impacts to very critical infrastructure like hospitals that are built along the coastlines. There is also an anticipated increase in wildfire and smoke risk, and the increased vulnerability of remaining fragmented forest stands at that stage. The IPCC also has made some socio-economic projections. If what we achieve is a 2-degree world. That means capping temperature rise to 2 degrees for Southeast Asia. That is a slowdown in the economic growth and poverty reduction. It will further erode food security. There will be a decline of up to a third of crop production, and also a major decrease in land productivity. And it'll trigger new poverty traps, will exacerbate the multidimensional poverty. Now, this is not going to happen just in 2100. It'll be a progressive thing that will happen through time. And as you all might be well aware, under the current circumstances, we are not meeting 1.5 degrees. We are not even meeting 2 degrees. We are actually heading close to 3 degrees temperature rise. So, I just wanted to present this as the backdrop on why it's important, not just at the global stage, but particularly with regard to what could be the impacts in Southeast Asia with climate change. Secondly, the World Economic Forum has increasingly identified both climate action failure and biodiversity loss as the key risks for businesses in the next 10 years, both in terms of impact and likelihood. 5 of the top 10 risks in its latest 2021 report relate to natural resource crisis, biodiversity loss, and climate change. Now, Southeast Asia is quite unique in its rich biodiversity composition. For example, it contains most, if not all, of Asia's tropical rainforest, with many of the Southeast Asian countries near or on the equatorial belt, providing a rich carbon sink, providing climate regulation in terms of microclimate protection and resilience to the impacts of climate change, resilience against things like flooding, landslides, coastal erosions that are predicted. And we also have this wonderful sea space called the Coral Triangle. This is the epicenter of global marine diversity. It contains 32% of global coral reefs, and the area also has more than 30% of mangroves. And these are actually the nursery of fishery. So again, providing important source of global protein for food security. Now, Malaysia is ranked 12th richest in terms of biodiversity in its endemism. However, Southeast Asia generally has the largest number of threatened species in the Asia-Pacific region. Now, thirdly, what I'd like to say here is the thing to note is that natural systems help regulate climate, whilst nature loss drives climate change. Nature also provides multiple services to people: food, water, fiber, medicine. And climate change too, however, drives nature loss. Now, ultimately, it's human activities that can drive both climate change and nature loss. At the same time, people can protect and restore nature, thereby securing many benefits, both in terms of addressing climate change and securing other important societal benefits like food and water security. Now, these are all critical elements in meeting the overall objectives of the Sustainable Developmental Goals, which is leaving no one behind by 2030, because it provides fundamental basics for that good quality of life that the SDGs seek for everybody. So we therefore need investments into protecting nature in Southeast Asia as an important strategy in addressing global climate change and meeting the SDGs. So let me now quickly focus on an area that is of great significance in Southeast Asia, the oil palm industry. Oil palm means different things to different people. It has been associated with vast deforestation and displacement of iconic species like the orangutan in Borneo and Sumatra. And as you would all know, this has also led to many campaigns against palm oil use in the West. It has also been associated with the frequent smog or haze, as it is called here, resulting from land clearing activities. Let's look at it from another lens. Oil palm produces the highest yield per hectare of any vegetable oil. What does this mean? To replace oil palm in products, more land would be needed to produce the equivalent amount of oil, vegetable oil. And where would this land be found? Very likely in the remaining forested areas. So globally, really, this does not make any sense. Now, oil palm also has been successful in the region in elevating poverty. Many smallholders depend on their oil palm production for their livelihoods. If the world boycotts palm oil, there are severe consequences both to the environment and society. So what's the way forward? To ensure that the oil palm that is being consumed is produced sustainably. In Malaysia, there is now a mandatory requirement for all oil palm to be certified, including the oil palm produced by smallholders under the local MSPO certification scheme. There is also an effort to cap plantation expansion to 6.5 million hectares or 20% of the land area, and also a requirement for no new planting on peat. And in the state of Sabah, in Borneo, they have adopted a jurisdictional approach and committed to producing all of their oil palm under the RSPO certification, which is a higher level of certification in the near future. On top of that, Malaysia actually maintains a forest cover of over 50%. And this does not include the oil palm cover I mentioned just now, right? So over 50%, this was pledged back in 1992 in the Rio Earth Summit, and that forest cover is still remaining. But this is where we need to make sure that it gets protected and it remains, right? So now let me give you an example very quickly of a Malaysian company that has shown that taking biodiversity needs into account in its business DNA provides positive outcomes for biodiversity and its business. This is the case of Sabah Soft Food, which is a company in Sabah, which cultivates timber and oil palm. And its concession areas include traditional elephant migratory routes. So because of this, elephants used to come in and their crop damage would be, quite huge. In 9 years, it was about 4 million Malaysian ringgit. And whatever mitigation measures that they took did not quite work. And also that caused, human-elephant conflict. So there was a task force, collaborative task force that was set up by the state government, Sabah Soft Food, as well as WWF Malaysia. And using scientific knowledge, instead of putting electric fences all across the terrain, they were realigned to areas which science said would be the places where the elephants would most likely come to, and also to create wildlife corridors between forest reserves to provide a space for the elephants and increase worker security. And because of this, their cost was actually reduced from having to spend 500,000 ringgit annually to about 20,000 only in terms of addressing this human-wildlife conflict. But more importantly, it reduced that human-wildlife conflict. So they have found value in this, and recently they announced setting aside some of their production area for reforestation so that that can become an elephant corridor. Now, these kind of initiatives where efforts are being undertaken to make the oil palm production more sustainable so that it actually produces, bearing in mind many aspects of environmental and societal needs to be supported. And global support has to be given for this. For example, from multinationals who support the buying of oil palm produced in a sustainable manner. And in this, I think Unilever is already embarking on this journey. We also need, in terms of planning, taking landscape approaches so that people's needs, the economy, and the environment are taken comprehensively together across the landscape and not, one for the other being traded off. So I think I'm probably running out of time. So to conclude, I would strongly urge that, when we think of investments, when we think of financing, any projects, the climate risks need to be taken into account, but please also look at, how in conjunction with that, nature and nature's services can continue to be supported, so that it provides these fast ecosystem services to enable continued production activities and continued well-being of the people. Thank you.
Thank you, Lavanya, for that thought-provoking remarks. If I can hand over to Dr. Hamim Sharum, Deputy Director of Bank Negara Malaysia, Central Bank of Malaysia. All yours,
Thanks,
sir.
Yeah. Hi, all. My points will be from regulators' perspective, focusing environment and climate change. Allow me to elaborate on 3 points relating to this. I coined this as WWI. Not World War I, but rather whole bank approach, whole nation approach, and inclusiveness. The first one is important for us to actually engineer a strategic collaboration within our immediate sphere of influence. In this case, with our regulators, with our banks, with our insurance companies. Why? Because for financial sector to play a catalytic role in supporting this transition to low carbon economy, the whole bank approach. I give you an example. In Malaysia, Bank Negara and Securities Commission have established this Joint Committee on Climate Change, or JC3, with the financial industry to promote alignment on climate actions across multiple stakeholders, comprising the stocks exchange, financial institutional investors, and non-government organizations. So this JC3, or Joint Committee on Climate Change, started small, but has within the past 2 years found its way to become the impetus to collective climate actions within the financial sector. So we have seen that involvement in its role that goes beyond coordinations to also include providing content, stewardship, and advocacy. So the increasing breadth and depth of the work undertaken by its 4 subcommittees, JC3 itself have 4 subcommittees, have led to a greater push for alignment between financial sector and national climate strategy through our active engagement with the government. Second, a greater push towards climate-related disclosure. And third, in a way, pave way to the development of potential tools and financial solutions to address barriers to green financing and investment. My second point is following convening within the financial sector, so we can extend our scope of collaboration at national level to advocate a more coherent approach in managing these environmental and climate risks, the whole nation approach. In Malaysia, for example, as financial and economic advisor to the government, Bank Negara have actually had an important role in informing the government policy and strategies to ensure an orderly transition to low carbon economy, one that delivers meaningful progress while minimizing significant social and economic dislocations. Here in Malaysia, the bank advocates for coordinated national strategies and apprise on the financial sector priorities through various engagement with government. The newly set up Malaysia Climate Change Action Council, or MyCAC, also provides another channel for the bank through Finance Minister to share its views. The third one is the most important one to me, is in fostering the collaboration, we need to be cognizant of the need for environmental and climate policies and strategies to maximize transition benefits and minimize its downside. It's because for developing countries and emerging countries like Malaysia, the inclusiveness is key to avoid these macroeconomic and social dislocations as we transition to low carbon economy, as mentioned by Lavanya just now. I will elaborate further on this. In our quest to prepare Malaysian financial system to become more climate resilient, the bank aims to support orderly transition that is consistent with preserving inclusive financial services to the individual as well as to the business. So our measures to strengthen the climate resilience are designed to also provide a meaningful support and viable financial solution to help businesses to transition towards green activities and operations. So in our view, this is particularly important for resource-based country like Malaysia, as mentioned by Lavana just now, because we have a risk of stranded asset if this disorderly transition occurs. So as an example, Bank Negara principle-based taxonomy, which was issued earlier, developed with this in mind. So this taxonomy aims to facilitate the direction of financial flows to activities that support transition to low carbon and climate resilient economy. It also supports businesses in transitioning by recognizing the climate risk mitigant and adaptation effort over time, while preserving the rigor of assessment by avoiding greenwashing. And the taxonomy itself also encourages financial institutions to nurture and nudge the business, not to exclude them, but to nurture them towards transition to greener practices. So in a way, it provides the development of account where they can help build the capacity within the business itself to better manage climate risk. Finally, the bank sees a great value in pursuing coordinated and regional coherent financial sector response to climate change, which highlighted by Cecil just now. So here, Bank Negara is also working closely with our central bank in the region on this area. That includes capacity building and taxonomy. I'll stop here. Thank you, Prasad.
Sorry, Rafi, please, you're next. Go for it.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum and good day to everyone. I would like to thank GFI and AICB for organizing this session, and I'm delighted to be part of this panel. As you mentioned, I am from CIMB Group, and I look after the sustainability practice at CIMB Group. And I want to highlight why CIMB as a group started this sustainability practice, and why is it important for us as a financial institution. We have a strong footprint in ASEAN, predominantly in Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore, Thailand, Cambodia. And we find that these countries are blessed or endowed, as Lavanya mentioned, with rich and diverse biodiversity. And we realize that, to whom much is given, much will be required. So we have a responsibility, first of all, to do the right thing, to ensure that as an intermediary, a financial intermediary, we know that our funds ends up into various development areas that would have an impact, direct or indirect, on the environment. So we wanted to make sure that when we give out financing, we do the right thing by checking not only the financial impact, but also the impact to people and planet. So we went beyond profitability to look at prosperity and to also look at the benefit to people and planet. So that was a call we made back in 2018. And we realized that we need to put a robust framework around it to ensure that, of course, we have a measurement for profitability. We now have to look into a framework and measurement for impact to people and planet. So we have set up a sustainability department that will work with various business units and business enablers to ensure that first we look at our own conduct. Before we change the world, we have to change ourselves. So it has to start from home. We are looking at our own footprints, how much energy we consume, how much water we consume, how much paper we consume, what is the waste that we recycle or we produce. So we have now a baseline that we want to reduce. So the plan is in our own conduct of business, we will reduce by a certain amount through efficiency and reductions. And we will, of course, the remaining will have to migrate towards renewable energy. And to the extent we are not able to convert to renewable energy, we will try to offset through carbon credits. That's the last resort. So there is one angle in terms of growing what we call our sustainable action and our conduct to make sure year on year we become a more sustainable bank in terms of reducing our footprints and increasing our handprints by moving towards more cleaner, renewable energy and more sustainable practices. Then we have the most important part of it is what we call the impact through financing, what we call financed emission. because for every dollar that we give out as a financing, there will inevitably be some impact to climate. So if you give a loan or financing to buy a car, that car will produce some emissions. The same goes to providing a financing to a manufacturing entity that is going to build certain products or other goods that will create some climate impact. So we now have to come up with a framework where we can evaluate all these various high risk, medium risk and low risk sectors and put a robust governance around it. So the approach that we have taken, and in line with what the likes of World Bank and IFC and others have done, is to understand the sectors that we are involved in. So we need to understand what is the impact on E, S, and also to some extent governance in each of the subsectors. So there are high subsectors like, for example, coal, forestry, mining. These are high impact sectors which would have a lot of carbon related exposures. And our plan there is to either exit or transit from that over a period of time. For example, coal, we have clearly come up with a policy by 2040, CIMB as a group will exit from any exposure to coal. So this is a target that we put in place, and we will have similar aspirations, targets for other sectors which are high impact. And on the other side, we have the medium and low, where we need to find a way to mitigate the risks to climate and come up with alternatives where we can nudge the sectors to move towards a more efficient business practices. Take, for example, poultry farming. Now, poultry farming, while creates food sustainability, creates job and economic development, also produces huge amount of methane and nitrous oxide. So how do we mitigate that? There are ways now we have found that using certain enzymes, certain microbes, you can actually reduce the production of methanes and this nitrous oxide. So there are new sciences that is developed, and we need to be, as financier, bring this technology, this information to our clients to say that, look, if you adopt these practices, good practices, and we're able to measure the reduction in methane and nitrous oxide, we'll be able to give you a financing that will be cheaper than a normal conventional finance. So this is what we call sustainably linked loans, where we give incentive. We give incentive to clients. If they meet certain targets, then we'll be able to give them a cheaper cost of financing. At the same time, we're also pushing the customers to opt out for green certified home financing. So if they buy a home that's green certified, then we'll be able to give them a financing at a cheaper rate. Same goes for hybrid cars, electric cars. So collectively, what we are looking at is that a bank has to play a role. In CIMB being a regional player, we want to make sure that we bring this message to our customers, to our stakeholders, to our shareholders, that we are here for doing good in the community, and we will reduce the negative impact, what we call footprints. At the same time, we will create incentives and various programs to build what we call positive impact sector financing that is going to improve what we call the handprints. So that's been our journey. There's been a lot of challenges, but working together with the likes of WWF and other global organizations, we've been able to come across many of these challenges. We've been able to tackle those challenges, and I think we will be able to meet our targets in the years to come.
Thank you, Rafi. If I can call on Cedric Remo, Fund Manager at Earthwake Green Impact Fund in Singapore. I believe Cedric has a video for us.
Hello, I am Cedric Remo, the Fund Manager of Earthwake Green Impact Fund, managed by First Degree Global Asset Management in Singapore. We invest in green, social, and sustainable debt instruments, and the disclosure is key to attract investors who are looking to invest their capital with impact. As part of Earthwake's governance, we align with the International Capital Markets Association Green, Social, Sustainable, and Sustainability-linked bond principles. We have teamed up with ESG Tech, a homegrown Singapore-based next-generation verified ESG data exchange platform. They are specifically focused on servicing the relationship between financial institutions and our corporate clients. As part of our investments, we commit to reporting at least annually on the impact of our projects to our investors. In this case, the data for us starts in the field. Our investee, Lionheart Farm, a sustainable coconut plantation in the Philippines, enters the data directly via an app, and it's fed into their profile on the ESG tech platform. We have developed an app called Scientific that allows the farmers to count the number of coconut trees that are planted on their plantation. Lionheart has committed to planting 40,000 new coconut trees, which is part of the impact that we have promised to our investors, some of whom are managing reforestation funds. From here, Lionheart can log into the platform, review their data feed, add some commentary, and start the auditing process of the KPI loan data. At Earthwake, we aim to provide our investees with new technology to take advantage of market opportunities, manage future risk and regulatory framework. At this stage, our fund managers can review the data themselves, as well as the live auditing process, to ensure the integrity of the data at each stage. Lionheart's data is then fed automatically into our Earthwake ESG tech profile, where we can add information about our green and social framework. We can also add the percentage of funds allocated and so on to complete our ESG report made up of audited aggregated data. In the end, we have a professionally looking report which we can post on our website and communicate to our investors. Validated reporting is very important to establish trust in our investment opportunities. With ESG tech, we can achieve a consistent delivery of professional reports aligned with the highest market standards.
Thank you, Cedric. We'll come back to you with questions a little later, but if I can call on David Smith of Standard Investments in Singapore as well to give his remarks.
Hello, and thank you so much for having me. I'll be brief in my comments, given many of my panelists have covered many of the comments I was going to make about this region, but I'll talk from an investor's perspective. So as we sit in Singapore, I sit in Singapore and look around Southeast Asia, we see a terrifically exciting region, one that's growing economically, one that's lifting incomes across this region and growing prosperity across this region. And that's leading to growing consumption in ASEAN and Southeast Asia as well. As an investor, that's terrifically exciting and presenting a number of opportunities. On the other hand, this growing consumption presents a growing call on raw materials, commodities, and agriculture of this region and beyond, all of which has a significant environmental impact, and also an increasing demand on infrastructure across the region as well, necessary from a social perspective, but also with tensions from an environmental perspective. We also see continued growth in power demand as well across this region, as this growing economic prosperity translates to growing demand for power. And again, that presents a number of environmental issues for investors across this region. At the same time, ASEAN is home to many of the commodities, hot, soft and hard, that are necessary for this growing prosperity within the region, and also is home to commodities that may be really important for the growth in electrification around the world. This presents an interesting tension between, again, the prosperity of Southeast Asia and the need to extract some of these commodities potentially, and also the environmental footprint of these commodities. Finally, this growth and these tensions around environmental footprint are taking place against a backdrop of the need to decarbonize and electrify economies at a rapid pace as these economies are growing. Now, this presents opportunities for investors, particularly as we see growth in renewables, as we've mentioned earlier, but also it presents risks around existing infrastructure in this region. This is terrifically important globally as we face the risk of climate change, but particularly in Southeast Asia, given the archipelagic and low-lying nature of this region. So as investors, we're seeing lots of really interesting opportunities to invest in companies in this fast-growing region, but also the need to really look for companies that are growing sustainably alongside this growth in ASEAN. And it's really exciting be able to channel capital sustainably within this region along some of the ways that have been mentioned by my fellow panelists earlier. I'll leave it there and we can get into some of these on the panel discussion in a minute. Thanks a lot.
Excellent. Thanks, David. So let's jump straight into some questions. I'll start with Lavanya because she's had a little bit of a break. Lavanya, what are the enablers that are needed to transition to a more sustainable world, do you think? It's clearly needed to address the existential crisis you painted at the end of the day. And, with climate change and the loss of nature, if you could, a few words on that.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, thank you. And certainly, I mean, there are a number of things that need to happen. And I think my fellow panelists have actually touched on quite a few things and some exciting developments, especially in the banking sector here in Asia, in Southeast Asia and Malaysia. So the things that drive change is the financial sector, and I think both Rafi and Dr. Hamim have described like things like the impact and incentives. Sort of impact assessment and the incentives that need to be given to drive sustainability, and also from the broader regulatory perspective, how that's being supported. In addition, we also need recognition from the global players as well. So we need a supply chain that demands for sustainable production. So it's incumbent on production to embrace sustainability across the chain, right? So when you have sustainable production here, you need to have the demand for it across the globe, and that also means to encourage it. From the banking sector, the incentives to give preferential financial treatment. Again, premium prices probably need to be incorporated to push that demand. You also need to look at it from a holistic perspective. I touched on that a little bit. When we look at some of these commodities, we need to see what is the alternative, and the regulation that needs to go across the different types of, say, vegetable oil, not just sort of pinpointing one. So yeah. So I think, these are some of the things that need to be considered as we move forward. Yeah.
David, you seem to have something to say about the alternatives to palm oil and stuff like that. Do you want to elaborate on anything there?
It's a really divisive topic, I know, and it was mentioned in comments from a few panelists earlier around this global focus on palm oil, and I think Lavanya mentioned that potential Western boycotts of palm oil. I think our perspective is very much aligned to WWF. That it is a crop that has significant yield advantages against its alternatives. It provides, can potentially provide a lot of social good, working with smallholders, and so the answer to us as investors is to look for producers that are growing palm sustainably and in a way that works well with smallholders to ensure that everyone shares these economic benefits, rather than just to avoid and boycott a sector as a whole, because the alternative actually is much, much worse. If you think about the amount of land that would be required for the alternative, the best bet for us is to focus on the ones that are doing it well and channel capital there.
Right. I just wanted to, Dr. Hamim, I just wanted to focus on the potential for, regulatory incentives for the banks to accelerate the sustainability agenda, basically. And Rafi, please feel free to chime in on wish lists at this point.
Yes, quite an interesting question, though. Yeah, okay. I can talk from two perspectives. Remember, I've talked briefly on the taxonomy just now.
Yeah.
To further support these transition activities, one of possible option is to look into perhaps consider the establishment of special fund to assist the businesses, particularly the SMEs, to transitions, and then to be tagged to that taxonomy. and can be used by the bank in providing financing as well as in their decision making. For example, in the taxonomy, there will be several categories, and maybe funds can be tagged with the taxonomy in such a way that if the companies move to the higher level towards green, for example, it can get better incentive by way of better financing, and vice versa. The other options, in a way that somehow alluded by Lavanya to a certain extent, Rafi, is actually through capital charge,
Right.
easiest way. It can be either carrot or sticks. For example, less capital charge for bank financing towards green versus higher capital charge for bank financing investment to so-called brown. But one could argue that I need data. But the question is when you can get those data. So now the onus is us to start with that, maybe towards pillar 2 capital, perhaps to start on that. Yeah, those are
I think that's a fair point. I mean, if you look at one angle is to look at whether we should pay premium price. For example, for the Muslim community at least, they would not go for a lower priced product if it's non-halal. So the price point is not material when it comes to being halal or non-halal. So if a chicken is halal and is more expensive than non-halal, they'll still go for it. Although they prefer same price, but if the market only sells halal chicken at a higher price, the Muslim community will only stick to that price, even though there is non-halal available at a cheaper price. So I think you must walk the talk. If the West is looking for sustainability and then is not able to pay fair price, so I'm saying if you have these plantations that are moving towards MSPO or RSPO, they are going to incur cost in terms of moving to become a sustainable plantation. Now, if they're not able to get fair price, and you've got another plantation which is a free rider, not following or not complying with it, with the RSPO and able to produce at a cheaper price, that's not fair to those people who are compliant. And that's where I think the discussion of brown versus green comes in. Now, surely we know whether a particular, what we call industry or a play in that industry is green or brown. We know there's a way of certifying it. So if I'm a manufacturer of a certain product and there is a certain form of certification, if I certify it, then I should get the normal price in terms of financing. If another brown company, it fails to certify it, then there must be an additional capital charge. It could be under pillar 1 or pillar 2 for capital charge for the banks. And that will then incentivize or disincentivize them to continue with these bad practices. I think that's one way of nudging the industry to shift towards sustainable practices.
Right. I just want to bring Cedric in here, and your video was extremely interesting. You're talking about one project, and you've got all the data, so on and so forth. I just wanted, because my question's always been this. First of all, I just wanted to discuss greenwashing very quickly. I think KEPCO issued a $500 million bond or something like that, and then invested in coal-fired power plants. Now, that's very obvious. Sustainably linked bonds as well out there. Basically, it feels like the bar set is rather lax. For instance, they seem to make their KPIs or covenants by the third year out of a 10-year bond, or step kick in like the 9th year or something, Cedric. So you seem to have found a way of keeping in touch with the use of proceeds per se. But is that easy to scale up, though?
Thank you very much, Prasad. It's a pleasure to be here. So indeed, you raise a very interesting point. Greenwashing can be a worry for investors, especially when those investors are located in far distant markets. And that's actually the opportunity of sustainable finance for Southeast Asia, is to attract capital that is located in developed markets, and in many instances that is earning very low returns and sometimes negative yields. These investors, obviously, they don't know that well Southeast Asia, and the markets themselves are very different, when you compare all the different countries that compose the region. So finding a common language around sustainability has been a challenge. However, we've made significant progress with the ASEAN Green Bond Principles, for example, the ASEAN Taxonomy that is being developed, as was raised earlier. And what we are trying to do at Earthwake is zoom in on opportunities for investors where there is clear benefits of new projects, new developments of new technology in the region. And the projects that we showed in the video, Lionheart, is located in Palawan, which is a province of the Philippines that before the business started had a poverty rate of about 60%. But the fact that they started to offer jobs for the community and jobs that were really aligned with the local practices of harvesting coconut, which is a major crop in the Philippines, that brought a lot of social benefits as well. They were able to reduce the poverty rate. But you're right. What is very important for the investors is that the measurement is correct, that we are able to measure the impact on the ground. So what we have put together is a framework where the agricultural business is able to plant new trees, and we are able to account for those new trees being planted on behalf of investors through our technology that is developed here at the heart of Southeast Asia in Singapore. So there are lots of benefits of complying with global standards. The technology is right at at our doorsteps. And this will bring great benefits for the region as well as high quality jobs, to be honest. So that's very positive. And by the way, I would like to also cite a study that was released recently by the Climate Bonds Initiative on the reporting practices for green bonds. And they found that actually almost 100% of the issuers have been reporting over the last 2 years on the bond allocation of the proceeds. So that's very encouraging. That means the principles are strong and the standards are being complied with. So I think greenwashing does represent a risk, but it's a relatively it's a risk that is being managed, and we are trying to manage it the right way as well.
So how is it that a quasi-sovereign can get away with bold-faced coal investments right after raising 500 million now? But that's another story altogether. David, I just wanted to come back to you on a concern. We talk about the transition from brown to green having certain sort of impacts. But the thing is, a lot of funds are tied up, people's pensions at the end of the day. If ESG does become big and there's this entire flow of money, how do you control that outflow of potential cash from one into the other, so on and so forth? Or do you just let the market deal with it? Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, it's a good question. So obviously, there's this huge interest in sustainable investing at the moment around the world, and certainly Asia's catching up on this interest in sustainable investing. I think there are two components to that. One is investing in companies with a pure play, or what I would call an end state solution, or we can call green. So these would be a pure play renewables company, for example. And there are funds investing in these type of companies who have reached the destination. And then there's the investment strategies that may look to invest in transition. So these would be companies that are helping transition or companies that are in transition. So maybe not at green, but on their way to green. Now, there will be a strong interest in the end state companies, I think. So investing in companies that are at that status of green. But I think what's really important is that we need to remember that there are companies that need capital to help that transition from brown to green. And so avoiding those companies and removing them from the investment universe is not always the best way to effect change on a system-wide basis. If we need to decarbonize, if we need to electrify, then helping companies decarbonize and helping companies move to that higher level of energy efficiency is important, but also is interesting from an investment angle. There will be lots of funds who are holding companies that are in transition or are not yet at green, that are maybe not engaging with those companies in the way that they could be and trying to effect change the way they could be. And I think the challenge there for consumers of funds or buyers of funds is to hold fund managers to account and ask them, what are you doing in terms of engagement? What are you doing in terms of having that discussion with companies to understand how they're making that transition and how are you reporting this to your clients? So I think that's where the focus will be in understanding what work fund managers are doing to help that transition.
Rafi, are banks shareholders putting on that kind of pressure? Are you seeing that at all here, for instance?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, as a listed company, we do have international funds, institutional investors as shareholders, and the pressure is increasing year on year to disclose our climate action and emission, what we call targets. So, as I mentioned earlier, the first point that we looked at is the sustainability angle for us is what we called the right thing to do, is our responsibility. At the same time, we're also seeing an enhanced requirement from all our stakeholders, whether shareholders, the regulators, the customers, they're all looking for sustainable solutions from us. So it was really timely. And I think, as mentioned by David, we are taking a mid to long-term view. Some sectors which are high pollutant, we have a 10-year timeline to exit or shorter. Others, we take a more nuanced approach where we need to work along with them to guide them throughout this process. That's why we're working with various stakeholders in Malaysia to bring in the right technology, whether it is paddy farming or poultry farming or manufacturing, food manufacturing. All these negative impact needs to be slowly eradicated, working together with the various stakeholders and having this incentive by giving financing at a lower rate or charging a higher rate for those people who are recalcitrant, who are refusing to move, will help to shift the move towards sustainable finance.
Can I also ask about a more? You've spoken about lending out to certain industries and so on and so forth, and incentivizing them. But the big elephant in the room at the end of the day, I feel, is like the mortgage is basically has to be tied to some sort of not just bunging solar panels, but basically buying a house on a beach that may not be there in a few years. Developers, I think concrete has got an extremely large carbon footprint. At the end of the day, in any nation, mortgages are a very large part of the credit portfolio. How is that being looked at? I never hear much about it.
So we started this journey in 2018 itself. We have offered what we called incentive pricing, cheaper pricing for those people who take green certified mortgages. But the problem is in Malaysia, there are not that many products in the market. If you look out in the market today for new launches, how many of these new homes are green certified? Very few. So again, it boils down to the tax system or regulatory system, where if a developer goes for approval, and if he goes with a green certified plan, then he should be able to get certain incentives. So if there are no incentives, then for them, they're quite agnostic. And the market is not really dying to get the green certified building. So that's where the challenge is. While the desire is there, we're not seeing that much of an action in terms of shifting towards green certified properties.
Well, I'm saying you will be sitting on a bunch of mortgages, for instance, that are in areas which are at high risk. Do you, put capital against that, et cetera, or is that, Dr. Hamim, do chime in if you've got any views on how this.
So this we are doing
housing sector. Sorry, yes.
So what we call this climate risk analysis, focusing on physical risk and transition risk. So physical risk would be if you've given mortgages to certain areas which are prone to, say, flooding, those will be reflected as higher risk. For mortgages, pretty much is covered through insurance. Insurance does cover floods. But if it's something else which is not covered, then that risk will pass back to the customer and indirectly to us. So that's something which we just started. I think most banks are still in the process of evaluating the physical risk to their financing portfolio.
Yeah, sadly not in our remit, but I think the insurance sector is something under the spotlight for now.
That's right.
I think if I may add, like Rafi mentioned just now, physical risk, I think some of the banks have addressed that in a way that they use technology by way of using the geospatial in assessing their financing decisions.
Nice.
But more so, the key risk actually for me is on transition risk. So that's why we have seen the bank providing financing to support the solar installations that could help the companies to transition towards more sustainable practices. But again, I agree with Rafi that the fact that our bank, some of the bank actually have actually preference to allow to provide this kind of a green financing towards a green building, solar, renewable energy. But again, the demand is there, but the supply of those green building, we want to see more. But of course, the alignment between the financial sector and the government will be continuously improved moving on.
Sorry, Lavanya, you wanted to say something.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in there just to add to what Rafi and Dr. Hamim have already mentioned, which is I think increasingly we also need to see maybe financing for efforts to make these investments resilient as well. For example, if you have a coastal construction, you may want to also provide incentives or investments money to protect the mangrove area that would protect against storm surges that are expected with climate change, for example, and protect coastal erosion. So these are some of the things where we can start integrating, nature values into, these kind of investment decisions, I think.
I think that's a really good point, Prasad. You see, while we are looking at, protecting the livelihoods of the fishermen because the stock, the fish stock is depleting. So what we do is that we help them to move towards aquaculture and other forms of farm fishing. Right. I think the focus should be in preserving the mangroves. See, because of the erosion and other climate change, the mangroves have been impacted, and that affects the fisheries, and they're not able to create the stock that we need. So the demand is dropping. Sorry, supply is dropping. So the focus should be not on creating more aquaculture and farm fishing, but more towards protecting and preserving our mangroves.
But on that scale, Lavanya, I wanted to ask you, we know what half the United States thinks about climate change, for instance, that it doesn't exist and et cetera, et cetera. Do you still see skepticism in the region? Or is that a silly question? Are people all just people and normally distributed?
Well, I mean, we haven't seen the extent of skepticism that you might see, locally from what we saw in the US. But does that mean that therefore action matches up with the, what we would therefore expect if people are actually very convinced about this as an existential crisis? Maybe not 100% there, but I think we are seeing movement towards that direction in the region. We are seeing advances. So, some of the countries are already looking at carbon pricing. I think Singapore has already announced that. Malaysia, we are actually studying that, and we, using that again, our natural wealth, the forest. We've already come up with a framework which can enable corporates to support our forests under the REDD Plus financing framework to sort of build that business advancement, if you like. I mean, so it's to get the carbon, but also to protect your supply chain, as we talked about, right, by protecting the forest, right? And in addition to that, I think in Malaysia, at least I know that the government is embarking on a study, sort of like a long-term study. So this will be like for a transition, if you'd like, in terms of a long-term low development pathway study. And ultimately, they're looking also at prioritizing what is important for planetary health. So this is very, I think, positive kind of approaches. And just to add to that, WWF with WWF Malaysia with Boston Consulting Group, we are undertaking a study for a net zero pathway for Malaysia, and we hope that these kind of efforts will provide ideas about where investments should go for that transition to happen. So if you'd like a looking glass and giving data and support for that transition.
Right. This is to possibly both Cedric and David. I remember like quite some time ago, maybe about 5-10 years ago, there were companies like Suzlon and Vestas, wind turbine producers, and they pretty much went bust, despite tons of subsidies and so on and so forth. And break evens on things like solar panels and all just weren't there. Are we at the right time for investing in this stuff? Because and how do you gauge when we're at the right moment? Basically, Cedric, if you have anything, if you know what I'm saying, basically. Because
well, I think that, there are real opportunities in new businesses. Renewable energy is one of them. Clearly, it goes beyond the pure play players. I think a lot of companies are realizing the benefits of investing in renewable energy sources. There are countries that are really taking a lead in the development of solar, for example. When you look at the way companies are also starting to report on their own footprint, it's quite encouraging as well to see that they see business opportunities to move to a zero carbon, net zero carbon solution at some point in the future. But you're right. In the past, there have been examples where the investments were not timed correctly. But right now, what we are seeing is the price of energy from renewable energy sources is becoming extremely competitive. And, it allows Southeast Asia to rely less on the imports of fossil fuels, which are an expense at the national level. So it's a benefit at the macroeconomic level as well.
Right. David, you had...
Yeah, just to add on to what Cedric was saying, I think that's why it's so exciting now to be looking at this, because if you look back to maybe when I was growing up, we knew that we needed to decarbonize. We knew we needed to reduce our reliance on fossil fuels, but the technology, wind, solar, was not at the point where it was economically viable. I think what's interesting is if you look at the cost downs we've seen from wind and solar, particularly solar in the last 10 years, we're at a point now where on a levelized cost of electricity basis, wind and solar are now competitive in many parts of the world, in many regions, and are cheaper in many places than new build fossil fuels. So as an investor, it's really interesting to look at these opportunities. And as a country, particularly in Southeast Asia, with a growing demand for power, that means that incremental demand for electricity can be met by incremental growth in renewables. So as you're building out your power base, you can build that power base in a way that is reliant on renewable energy rather than fossil fuels. We're at that point now where renewables start to become really interesting.
Just to go back to Cecile's point about how Europe's doing this whole Build Back Better stuff through the pandemic, do we see that in the region? Just to anyone, really. Are we actually seeing government investments going towards these sort of things?
We see it in Singapore. The response by the Singaporean government to the COVID crisis is an ambitious plan to transform the economy into green and to address some of the risks that exist for the longer term, like food security, is a big one for Singapore, for example, and that creates a lot of opportunities for innovation, like urban farming and using spaces that are really not creating any value to different uses. So, and there is also opportunities for cooperation across nations within the region, which, will over time benefit in better cohesion between the different economic agendas. There is still a lot of disparities within ASEAN between, developed markets and countries that are clearly behind. It's an opportunity to create value in Laos, Cambodia, even Myanmar to some extent, in Vietnam as well, and to catch up and to create a more harmonized economic environment.
Yeah, and how, at the end of the day, are we seeing intra-regional cooperation? Because at the end of the day, for instance, as you mentioned, peat fires, the haze is everyone's problem, really. And no one's, there's still not, inter-ASEAN cooperation on that front, which makes me despair once in a while. Are we seeing more government potential cooperation, or is that still there?
I think that's a really great question. If you look at what's happening now, we're all looking at our own turfs. So I have a green environment, that's fine. But my neighbor who is not complying is destroying the environment, but it's going to impact me. But today, when we are doing our sort of a trade, we look at the cheapest option. So if our neighbor is producing palm oil, unsustainably, we still buy it because it's cheaper. So that's where I think we need to draw the line. We need to help our neighbor to be sustainable, because as you rightly pointed out, it's going to impact us very soon. It has already impacted us through COVID, haze, and other things. So it's all about, if production of palm oil is critical for that country to survive, can we not help them, number one, to increase yield, so that they don't need to keep on growing more palm oil, but extracting better. Today, we are getting about 3 to 4 tons per hectare. But in optimal conditions, you can produce 7 to 8 tons per hectare. So can we not help these producers or countries to enhance the yield, number one? Number two, can we not get investors to come and set up some plants here, some manufacturing entities that can use this crude palm and use the local labor, land, and other resources to make sure that the producing country gets a better return on the investment, as opposed to just producing and selling crude palm oil at the lowest price in the market today. So I think there needs to be a more measured approach in terms of containing this climate change, because it's not enough to say you cannot grow. How are we going to feed the growing population? That can only be through sharing of technology and other investments.
And if I may, it also goes with the creation of value for those ecosystems. For example, carbon credits is a real promise for protecting forestry, because the farmers that are burning the trees and creating the haze, they are doing that because there is an economic benefit for them to do so. If we can replace this economic benefit with creating value in their protection of the forest, then we can really change the game here. And that's what we are trying to do in the Philippines, for example, in this plantation, where we, instead of illegal logging and killing wild animals, farmers are now incentivized to plant new trees, because it creates job employment for their communities. And they see the poverty rate falling. That's really what needs to happen. And I agree, it's difficult to blame the neighbor because he's not doing the right thing, but we have to look at what's the incentives and try to change these incentives in the right way.
Okay. Sorry, yes, Vanya.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, no, I think just to add to all that, for Malaysia, maybe we should watch out for the 12th Malaysia Plan. We are hearing that, it's supposed to have a more integrated approach to the 3 pillars of sustainability, environment, economy, and society. And the reason I say this is because I think for investors, you also need, what government is doing as assurance that things will be stable. I mean, it's not just sound bites, but there are also measures in place. We heard about the regulators from Dr. Hamim, but broadly, there must be other things in place as well to give assurance to investors to come in to invest. So I think it would be good to keep an eye out for what the 12th Malaysia Plan, just a 5-year plan, says, which should be out soon. And I totally agree with Rafi. I mean, and the environment has no boundaries, and more we are becoming very globalized. So this is where we have to think globally, in terms of how we address these issues. Not as Rafi mentioned, look at it as turfs, but really think out further and take a more holistic approach towards these things and act in cooperation, not competition.
Which is what we've been doing through the pandemic with vaccines and stuff, obviously. But on that note, guys, I really need to wrap up and let you guys go. Thank you, Lavanya, Cedric, Rafi, Dr. Hamim, David, for joining us. It was enjoyable. I wish we had a little bit more time, but we have to go there. I mean, in closing, I'm reminded of a Native American Cree proverb that hung on many a teenage Gen X's bedroom wall that said, when the last tree is cut down, the last fish eaten, and the last stream poisoned, you will realize that you cannot eat money. So although it's trite, it's prescient. we've come a long way since then, but we still have a long way to go to realize this dream of turning the tide on climate change. And so we can't rest on any laurels. Thank you again for all your participation. Thank you to Gefi as well and all the team who put this together. Guys, good luck and stay safe.